Before I jump into any analysis, I do feel the need to qualify this video by saying that I don't want to disparage any individual person credited with working on this show. Despite what I'm about to say, I don't want to lay blame on anyone, except for maybe Disney and Rick Riordan himself, and I'll get to that later. But I don't want to say the people who edited these episodes suck and they should feel ashamed. We don't know, and probably will never know, the exact reasons why the show ended up the way it is. This instead is an educational exercise so we can learn from the mistakes of this show, however they happened, and not make them in the future. Because, as you can probably tell from the title, thumbnail, and if you have eyes from watching the show, that the editing of this show is really fucking confusing. I'd first like to start with an issue that isn't pervasive, but it is emblematic of the issues that the show has with handling flow. One of the most basic editing techniques you'll first learn is editing on the action, sometimes referred to as continuity editing. What this means is that if a shot ends with one action, the next shot should start continuing that action. Say for the sake of example, if I stand up in this shot, then the next shot should start with me finishing standing up. This allows each shot to naturally flow from one to the other, as maintaining the continuity of action merges the two shots into a single point in time. It's so effective that just here I completely changed locations, and it seemed natural. This not only extends to the action and movements of the characters on screen, but any movement in the frame, including the camera. Think of it in terms of lines of action, but in motion. Each shot has a movement, and it's typical to have neighbouring shots match in their motion, using periods of no motion to reset into a new movement. For a really basic example, take this sequence of shots from Season 3, Episode 4 of The Wire. This first shot starts with the camera backing up from the cars as they drive towards it. The motion currently is into camera, or backwards if you prefer, but right before the shot cuts, this car stops and someone walks across from screen left to right. This makes the motion now being towards frame right, and the next shot is the car moving in that direction, along with a camera pan that matches. Both the car and the camera stop, which allows the edit to cut to these shots as the camera starts to zoom in to everyone's faces for this little standoff. This is a concept that this show doesn't quite seem to understand. Most of the time, I wouldn't say it's super noticeable, as movements are small and they don't stick out, but for an obvious example, we have this scene in episode 2. Watch how the camera pushes and stops, and then Percy turns his head. So while the shot started with into frame motion, it ends with towards frame left, which means that the next shot should match that motion, or at least start motionless. What they instead cut to is what seems like the middle of a tracking shot into frame, so the motion of the edit is completely thrown off. Or how about this cut in episode 4? We have a pan up as Annabeth looks up, but before the shot actually finishes its motion, we cut to this locked off shot, so towards top of frame motion is being broken by no motion. You know, I could stand here all day and show a million different individual examples, like how the show loves to cross the 180-degree line, or how Percy just teleports to the Empire State Building at the end. Which I'm not sure is ever explained that's the entrance to Olympus, he just seems to know that, the way he seems to know everything before it happens, almost like he read the book just like we did and can casually stroll through the adventure. Or how cutting away from this shot before they resurface is a fundamentally terrible edit that destroys any sense of action. But none of that is really that important. While all of these are problems, they're not big problems. They don't make the show difficult to follow, they just result in an edit that feels sloppy. You know what, actually, that last one is important, but explaining that's going to take us down a whole nother editing rabbit hole. Let's play that back again. No, I didn't edit it that way. The show does in fact cut to black exactly like that. To explain why, let's have a little history lesson for the uninitiated. The old standard for live broadcast shows was that you'd either get a 30-minute or hour-long time slot for your episode, which had to include around 8 or 16 minutes of ads respectively. That's what these cuts to black are for. It's a placeholder for where the ads will go, and if you've ever watched a broadcast show on a streaming service or a physical release, you'll know that they keep this little break in. If we recut a scene from a show that originally aired with ads to remove this cut, it becomes pretty obvious why they leave in this empty segment.
Not for drinking.
Okay.
Cotton swab.
It's officially a waking nightmare.
Add Eat, Pray, Love soundtrack.
When
to
are the
work
police
out.
coming?
Now, the fact that these exist in a show that is releasing on a streaming platform which doesn't have ads is extremely baffling and a question I'm not sure we'll ever have the answer to. But it's ancillary to the point. Instead, what's important to focus on is how these affect the edit. What keen-eyed viewers might have already realised is that the show uses these scene transitions at very particular moments that line up with the book. They're chapter breaks.
Help you do what?
Win capture the flag.
This on its face is actually a really interesting editing choice for the adaptation of a book. I actually thought it was quite smart, a neat way to more accurately translate the flow of a book into a visual medium. But in a very clear case of that your first idea is usually not a good one, it became clear as the show progressed that this wasn't working. The reason this doesn't work comes down to the fact that time is perceived differently in a visual medium compared to a written one. This is why, of all the things that you need to keep track of in an edit, one of the most fundamental is time. Video mediums like film and television are fundamentally locked to the temporal plane in a way that written and static art media are not. And that means that the way that time flows within the story cannot be interpreted by the audience as they read, it must be implied by the edit. This means that a scene transition, even when the transition matches as closely to the abrupt pause and information flow of turning a page, is much different than a chapter break. It's a lot easier for the start of a chapter to skip over more time than any scene transition, as you do not physically perceive the flow of time of the story. It's why things like montages exist. They act to visually show the relationship in time between two different scenes, and it's also why scene transitions in this medium are very important to create proper pacing in the edit. You can do this in many ways. The most basic, and one the show employs on a number of occasions, is the simple cutaway, implying the passage of time in one scene by cutting to another. But there are a lot of techniques you can use to accomplish this. This doesn't just extend to film and television. Any visual medium where you have to communicate information has to deal with this. Say, a YouTube video. Do you remember that video I made on the chapter Highway 17 in Half-Life 2? No you don't, because no one watched it, but it serves as a good example of this. The video has 4 main sections, each at a different location, and in order to transition to each location, I cut to these shots out of the car window driving past scenery, and use these smaller interlude segments inside of the car to allow for the passage of time, to make it seem like I was driving from location to location. If you imagine these shots as being cuts to black and remove all the interludes, you can see how this is similar to what's happening in Percy Jackson. The problem is though, is that I didn't just cut to black, and the interludes did exist. And also, this was a video essay and a YouTube video. The rules are a little bit looser, especially when attention spans are so low. I could get away with segmenting my idea so rigidly because that's how essays work. You make a bunch of smaller points that are connected in some ways, but mostly disconnected, but that all lead to a singular conclusion. In this case, there's not a story being told, the locations are purely for visual symmetry. But in this case, the story is the main priority, which is why I cut like this, acts to harm the show rather than helping. The two scenes feel like separate dimensions because the edit takes no time to flow from one scene to the next, instead relying on an editing technique used in a different format of television to emulate a feature of one medium that inherently doesn't work in this one. This is a problem throughout the show, but the underworld of episode 7 exacerbates it due to its visual design. Aside from the mostly quite lifeless art design throughout the show that results in the ugly shades of concrete that make the underworld look like an industrial park, or the overuse of the volume that results in this excessively flat lighting, it's the disorienting feeling that each location doesn't extend more than a few meters past the actors, another byproduct of poor use of the volume, that really shows visually the problem the show has overall with the flow of information. Each location feels disparate in a way where there's no solid flow from one location to the next, and in that way, it's actually not always the lack of temporal flow from one scene to the next that's the problem, and why the choice of using the ad break cuts themselves is not the issue with the edit. It's how no time is taken for the narrative to be properly linked together, how it feels like the story skips over so much crucial detail, and to demonstrate this is what I believe is probably the worst editing choice in the whole show, which is the end of episode 4 into the start of episode 5. Okay, so episode 4 ends with Percy falling off the St. Louis Arch into the Mississippi River, where he meets with this Nereid. The episode ends before she actually tells Percy anything, aside from the fact that he can breathe underwater. And episode 5 starts with this.
What happened? Short version? We need to go to Santa Monica.
Temporally, this makes sense. The break between episodes is where you can get away with the most amount of skip time. but it doesn't feel like it, does it? Rather than skip something extraneous, instead it's this crucial bit of the narrative that links these two episodes together, so the connection between this episode and the previous one is completely broken. It's implied that the narrator told him this, but because that's never actually shown, it feels like we've started halfway through the episode. Now, I've spent a lot of time discussing just the editing of the show, and that's because it's what I feel most qualified to talk about, but it's not the only problem that the show has, and to talk about that, mostly because I was afraid that she'd kill me if I didn't mention her grievances. So, originally this section was going to be one that was written and performed by my sister, but you know, idiot that I am, I didn't really consider the fact that privacy exists, and that she might not want to like physically perform it, which is fine. That's not weird. This is weird. What I'm doing is weird. Not wanting to do it, that's normal. But so I'm going to be the one who's going to perform this, but these are her words. When it was announced in 2020 that Percy Jackson was being rebooted, fans of the story waited with bated breath for the next 3 years. This is what we had been asking for since the first shitty movie came out in 2010, and aside from begging for Logan Lerman to be cast as Poseidon as an act of divinely inspired prophecy fulfillment, all we wanted was what the movies didn't provide: true faithfulness to the books. And that was the promise from Riordan and from Disney brand television, that it would be faithful. That was Rick's main problem with the movies. They were not faithful. In fact, Rick has gone on record many times complaining about how the movies are inaccurate butcheries of his source material, and how he begged the scriptwriters not to put his life's work through the meat grinder, to no avail. So to immediately, from episode 1, see places where the story had been adapted differently, gave me brief pause. But I was realistic. Beat for beat copying wouldn't have worked on screen, plus the first book came out nearly 20 years ago. Life has changed, the world has changed, and it's understandable that Rick may have wanted to evolve Percy somewhat from the original Percy that he wrote back in 2005. So what if there are a few small changes here and there in the first few episodes that modernize the story as opposed to completely changing it or losing its energy and charisma? I trust Rick, I trust his vision, etc. It was once we got into the later episodes, especially episodes 6 to 8, that modernization was completely cast to the wayside, and complete changes to the story and storytelling were made, and my faith in the faithfulness was lost. There are so many examples of this. Most, if not all, of the underworld scene, the kids figuring out that time moves differently in the Lotus Hotel as soon as they walk in, the fact that they figure out who Krusty is before even walking into his shop, the removal of the mechanical spiders in the water park. And I know Rick has said that this was due to it being a production nightmare to create the scene, but I find that a bit hard to believe given that he was being backed by $12 to $15 million an episode. There are feature films that do more with less, and I could go on. Most notably, there are fundamental changes made to the characters and to the way that the story is told. The most enjoyable and distinct element of the book is Percy's narrative voice. This doesn't exist in the show, which is fine. I can imagine not enjoying that in a televised context, but in lieu of having Percy's narration, what's been substituted in is a complete lack of effort to show instead of tell. There are so many scenes that I can reference, but I'm going to mention one I mentioned before. In the books, we meet Krusty because Percy, Annabeth, and Grover run into a store off the street to avoid being attacked by some generic teenage street thugs. They don't know who Krusty is and what he does, and so they get trapped by his waterbeds and have to battle their way out. It's a powerful moment, because Percy gets to show that he's not just Annabeth's goofy sidekick. He can go toe-to-toe with her in life-saving schemes when the moment calls for it. There are stakes because the kids don't know what's happening, and they have to fight for their lives on the fly. On the show, Percy literally says,
I know who you are. You're Procrustes. The beds are a trap. That's how you do it. I know there's a secret passage to the underworld here. I know you were left here to guard it.
where are the stakes? How are we supposed to feel like there's any sort of suspense or risk to these characters' lives? Anything to make us worry or care or get invested when most of the interactions these kids have with monsters is, I know who you are and I know what you do, therefore bypassing any significant conflict. The same thing happens in the third episode, when they arrived at Auntie M's Gnome Emporium and Annabeth straight away knew that Auntie M was Medusa. Where's the suspense? I'm not going to be worried about these kids if they go into each fight scene knowing what they're up against. And speaking of Annabeth, the fact that she figures this and so many other things out straight away is such an on-the-nose way of saying that she's smart. In the books, her intelligence is nuanced, and it's not just book smarts, it's also street smarts. Yes, she is wise, she is an excellent battle strategist. That's not missing. What's missing is the version of Annabeth who knows how to play the game with the gods. Yes, she knows who everyone is, but not just by looking at them or being fed lazy storytelling. She figures out who they are by speaking to them, assessing their behaviours, mannerisms, and things they talk about and covet, and she on the spot determines how to best behave politically with that god in order to keep them alive. She doesn't respect the gods, but she shows enough respect to keep their asses out of trouble. In the show, she doesn't respect the gods, period. She's hot-headed, bad-tempered, and spends most of her time bad-mouthing the gods here, there, and everywhere. In the books, Percy is the one who has a hot head and can't hold his tongue, and Annabeth has to tell him to shut up and be careful who he's talking to, because the gods can and will literally vaporize you if you piss them off. So why, in the TV show, is Annabeth not shutting up and being careful of who she's talking to? Is she the wise girl we're told she is, or is she not? We're getting two different stories. I want to stress that all the actors have nothing to do with any of my criticisms. They are all super talented actors who embody the work they were given well and represented the characters as they were written with both passion and professionalism. The issue I have is with the work they were given and the characters as they were written. It's one thing to be a pessimist who harps on every minute individual change to the story. It's another to be a huge fan of the Percy Jackson world, to be promised a faithful adaptation after so many years of the lack of faithfulness being a key critique to previous attempts by all parties, and then have the writers and producers in their $12 to $15 million of Disney money per episode fail to deliver on that promise. It doesn't feel like they've had to make sacrifices to adapt the story from page to the screen. So many of the sacrifices feel like they're being made for no discernible reason. To me, for a story that has originally been told so well, it doesn't make any sense for it to be taken apart like this. Anyway, I can't wait for season 2 and I will be watching every episode.
To be continued.
Also, I've heard mixed reviews about cunty gay Hades, but I loved him and I thought he was excellent. If you're gonna make any major adjustments to the story, at least make them cunty and gay adjustments. The first 4 Percy Jackson books are, in essence, road trip stories. The first most of all, and the fact that the edit fails to capture this is probably the biggest failing that the show has. The way it almost feels like the show is just a bunch of scenes that have been haphazardly glued together, it often doesn't feel like they're travelling across the continental United States, but more that they're just wandering in and out of different scenes in the ILM volume. The editing shot to shot is not awful, it's not in any way interesting except for maybe 1 or 2 shots, and some of it is actually kind of bad, but the best way I can think to describe what's wrong here is that the show has a fundamental lack of coherency in its edit. It's not awful enough to make the story impossible to follow, but it results in a sense that the story is being rushed through, that the edit has been tightened far too much, with no time taken to build the world, to express characters, or to have humour. The whole show feels like it's skimming through plot points, rather than telling a story. That's the main problem with the editing of this show, the connective tissue that links each chapter together into one story that is fundamentally baked into this medium, and isn't present in this one, hasn't been accounted for in this adaptation. Like I said up top, I don't want to blame anyone specifically for this. The way that shows are made, it's really impossible to do so. It's always difficult to know which discipline is responsible for a given problem, because as better essayists have put far more eloquently than I ever could,
filmmaking is symbiotic to the degree that flaws or failures in one area will impact the ability for others to do their jobs.
So as he goes on to point out, discussing issues in the edit is mainly discussing how a variety of issues manifest themselves in the edit. I say that because I want to pose a theory. This show reeks of being written by someone who is a competent writer, but who doesn't have experience screenwriting, and how these types of narratives need to be paced in a different medium. As the inner monologue of Percy isn't present to spend time describing the world, or characters like Chiron, or the other campers, or even Annabeth and Grover, the heart and the soul of the story is neither told nor shown. Now, as I said, I don't want to blame any one person, and TV writers' rooms are even more complicated than the writing of films as it is, but given how accurately that description could line up with Rick Riordan, it really does make me consider if that's what happened here. Rick has said that he didn't want to make this a beat-by-beat faithful adaptation, and as long as that the story felt the same, the specific details of the narrative don't matter. And I agree with that sentiment, and I also agree that I think that's what they were trying to do. But that's not what happened, as what they've changed doesn't actually help the story to be adapted into a new medium at all. It's extremely frustrating, because Percy Jackson is a very adaptable story. It's not very long, it's a simple narrative with charming characters and an interesting world, which all makes it ripe for exploration in a TV setting. I don't know if it's that Disney didn't give them enough screen time to properly explore the story, or if it was a lack of competency in screenwriting in the writer's room, but I know for sure that I'm disappointed.